I call it the madman theory, Bob. I want the North Vietnamese to believe I've reached the point where I might do anything to stop the war. We'll just slip them the word that, for God's sake, Nixon is obsessed about communism. We can't restrain him when he's angry and he has his hand on the nuclear button. If we do that, then Ho Chi Minh will be in Paris in 2 days, begging for peace.
Hello and welcome to the Creating History podcast and our series covering pivotal summit meetings where leaders, strategy and history collide on the world stage. I'm Russell Barnes, producer of television documentaries and now podcasts.
And I'm David Reynolds, Emeritus Professor of International History at Cambridge University.
So in this episode, we're going to explore the United States Summitry with the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union in the early 1970s. It's a critical moment in 20th century diplomacy that helped thaw the Cold War. And at the heart of the story is the really intriguing, paradoxical figure of Richard Nixon. His record would suggest he's one of America's most successful presidents on the international stage, at least. And yet his reputation today is really just one for paranoia and scandal. He's Tricky Dicky. You had to resign the presidency in disgrace after trying to cover up the Watergate break-in by his associates.
Yes, Nixon really was a bizarre mixture of near greatness and, frankly, incorrigible pettiness. He was a man who I think remained a perpetual outsider, even as he rose to the very peak of power as President of the United States. But in many ways, I think these contradictory traits came together because we'll explore how it's his position as an outsider that drives him to succeed on the international stage. Perhaps that also gave him the political imagination to reach out to countries that America had isolated. His 1972 summits in Beijing and Moscow with Mao Zedong and Leonid Brezhnev marked really the high watermark of his presidency, a moment when his ambition and his intellect outshone his personal demons.
Before we get into it, David, do you want to explain our title, Nixon Dances?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So it comes from the American composer John Adams' opera, 1987 opera, called Nixon in China. And one of the pieces he wrote for it was called The Chairman Dances. And that imagined Chairman Mao coming out of his stiff portrait on the wall to dance a stately foxtrot around the stage. And I think 1972 was when Nixon came to life on the world stage.
Clearly not as a natural foxtrotter, though. Let's start by exploring who Richard Nixon was.
Well, Nixon's early life was rough and tough. He grew up in a poor family in Southern California. His father, Frank, was harsh and overbearing, while his mother, Hannah, was a devout Quaker who showed little affection, very strict. Two of Nixon's brothers died young, and that, I think, left him emotionally withdrawn, but also fiercely driven. So he channeled that drive into relentless hard work. He won a scholarship to Duke University, one of the best law schools in the country. But even so, academic success didn't bring him social confidence. At Duke, he was named Gloomy Gus for being so serious.
Yeah, and Nixon remained someone who felt he had something to prove. He was a man with a huge chip on his shoulder.
Yes, his impoverished youth left him, I think, with a deep grudge against America's privileged elites. He was always on the lookout for slights, real and imagined. And Nixon's distrust of the East Coast establishment, as he saw them, became absolutely central to his political identity, because he portrayed himself as the champion of Middle America, the underdog who clawed his way up to the top, and his mixture of commie bashing and populist politics catapulted him from the House of Representatives to the Senate and into the vice presidency under Dwight Eisenhower, when he made a name for himself in foreign policy.
But then in 1960, Nixon was beaten to the presidency, ironically by an elite insider from the East Coast, John F. Kennedy. He's rejected again by voters in his 1962 bid to be elected as governor of California. But he licks his wounds and makes quite a stunning comeback in 1968.
Yeah, so Nixon was nominated as the Republicans' candidate for president in 1968. And this means he's ideally placed to really exploit the country's deepening crisis in Vietnam. And in our last episode, if you think back about Kennedy and Khrushchev's encounter in Vienna in 1961, we explored the summit's legacy of mistrust and anxiety that pushed the US into backing the anti-communist South in Vietnam. Well, by 1968, the Vietnam War that Kennedy helped get the US into has gone disastrously wrong. Americans are dying at the rate of 200 a week. There's no victory in sight, and this fans dissent and division at home. And in the campaign of 1968, Nixon projected a new image as the unifier of the country, a spokesman for those he called the silent majority of law-abiding Americans.
Was that a pose, or was there a more visionary side to Nixon?
Well, he devoured history books, he thought hard about grand strategy, and he was actually really moved by the lives of world leaders such as Woodrow Wilson and Winston Churchill. So I think he did see himself in some ways as almost a philosopher president. And he came to office in 1969 with a genuinely grand aim to thaw the Cold War and reshape world politics. And he was quite clear that to do that, he had to get America out of that quagmire in Vietnam.
So, entering the White House in January 69, Nixon's priority, as you say, is an exit strategy from Vietnam.
Yeah.
But his initial tactic is to do this by force, not diplomacy.
Yes, at first, Nixon acted with the same ruthlessness that had won him the presidency. His aim was to bludgeon the North Vietnamese communists to the negotiating table by round-the-clock bombing of their sanctuaries in Cambodia. He really wanted to shake and shock Hanoi. He wanted them to understand that he didn't play by normal rules. And he told his chief of staff, "I call it the madman theory, Bob. I want the North Vietnamese to believe I've reached the point where I might do anything to stop the war. We'll just slip them the word that, for God's sake, you know, Nixon is obsessed about communism. We can't restrain him when he's angry and he has his hand on the nuclear button. If we do that, then Ho Chi Minh will be in Paris in 2 days, begging for peace."
Gosh, David, that's uncanny. Did you know Nixon well?
But the quick fix didn't work. It didn't bring Hanoi to the negotiating table, and his saturation bombing provoked a backlash at home, fueling mounting public protest and press criticism. By May 1970, Nixon's presidency was in real trouble. And he was drinking too much, he was lurching between defiance and self-pity, so it was really bad.
But then at this low point, he comes up with a plan B.
Yeah, so out of the wilderness, if you like, rather like Churchill, he crafts a triumph. He saw that military might alone was not going to end the war in Vietnam. So he resorted to, if you like, cold, calculated diplomacy. He'd always felt that it was important for America to improve its relations with Russia and China. That had been a long-term goal, particularly with opening up to China. But now he also grabbed onto this as a way to put the screws on North Vietnam, because the Russians and the Chinese were their main source of supplies and weapons and so on. And what he intended to do was to provide Moscow and Beijing with sweeteners or inducements, deals that would persuade them to cut off those supplies and push Hanoi to the negotiating table.
How exactly would he be able to do that?
Well, particularly, I think, by playing on the fears in Moscow and in Beijing. The Soviets in particular were obsessed with China's growing military strength and its soaring population, which was already 3 times their own. And there's a quite amusing Moscow joke which captures this fear of the Chinese and the threats. It imagines a phone call between Nixon and the Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev. And it goes something like this. I hear you have new supercomputer with massive predictive power. That's right. Yes, indeed. So, Mr. President, please ask your supercomputer to predict names of Soviet Politburo in year 2000. And then there's a long silence, a very long silence. And finally, Brezhnev crows down the phone. So, Mr. President, your supercomputer not so super after all. Oh no, Mr. General Secretary, the names came up all right. It's just that I can't read Chinese.
Oh, very good. So there's a rift.
Yeah.
And exploiting this split between the two communist giants, that must have appealed to the grand strategist in Nixon.
Yeah, I think Nixon saw it as a kind of global chess game. If Washington thawed relations with Beijing, that would alarm Moscow and make it cozy up to America. That was his sort of scenario. And the price he would exact for these new, improved relationships would be an end to both Moscow and Beijing's support for North Vietnam. He put it fairly pithily, we're doing the China thing to screw the Russians and help us in Vietnam, and maybe down the road to have some relations with China. Move by move, he intended that all this would get him the peace he wanted and he needed to gain re-election in 1972.
Looking for a true crime podcast that goes beyond the headlines?
When I interviewed her 20 years on, she said that Fred told her there were hundreds of bodies buried in Gloucester.
It's a deeply disturbed love story.
Join Sky News crime correspondent Martin Brunt and journalist Helen Fospero on True Criminals, a weekly deep dive into the cases that shook the world, with insights so shocking they still haunt our imagination today. This is True Criminals.
You know him as a British bulldog and World War II hero, but who was the real Winston Churchill? New history podcast Creating Churchill explores the man behind the myth, how Churchill's life and legacy were shaped by relationships with tricky allies like Roosevelt and Stalin, enemies including Hitler and Gandhi, and his wife and most devoted critic, Clemmy. With fresh psychological insight and untold stories, Creating Churchill, available now on your favourite podcast app.
I suppose we're very used today to China being a presence on the world scene, but back in 1970, forging a new relationship between America and communist China was quite a gamble.
Yes, a huge gamble. At the time, engaging China was unthinkable for many Americans. Since Mao Zedong and the communists seized power in 1949, the US had refused to recognize what they called Red China. And after the xenophobic frenzy of Mao's Cultural Revolution in the 1960s, China had become a total pariah. I don't know, the equivalent today might be a Western leader arguing for talks with ISIS. But Nixon was convinced that an opening to China was now vital. Keeping on excluding it from international society would only intensify its hatreds and the threat it posed to its neighbours. As he put it very bluntly, the world cannot be safe until China changes. So Nixon's going against decades of US policy and public opinion, but he's sure it's the only way to reshape global politics.
Why did Chairman Mao and his premier Zhou Enlai put any faith in this total U-turn by the US?
Well, I think we need to recall just how precarious they felt in the late 60s and early 70s. Mao's China was isolated economically, diplomatically, militarily. It had just gone through the destabilizing chaos, self-imposed chaos of the Cultural Revolution, and it was locked in an escalating rivalry with the Soviet Union, supposedly their ideological ally.
The Sino-Soviet split was no small matter, was it? Actual fighting on the border was taking place in 1969.
Yeah, in fact, Mao was inclined to view the Soviet Union, not the United States, as the biggest threat to China's security. So when Nixon extends an olive branch, Mao sees it as an opportunity to play the Americans off against the Soviets.
You've talked of Nixon as a kind of global chess player, and I suppose his key piece in the game, his queen, if you like, was his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, who also became Secretary of State in 1973. And it was Kissinger who established the backchannels to Moscow and Beijing that would get the talks going. He was the Sherpa. Tell us about their relationship.
Well, I guess Nixon's, if you like, double act with Kissinger became one of the most extraordinary diplomatic relationships of the 20th century. And on the face of it, they seem a very unlikely pair. You've got the reclusive, workaholic son of a California grocer, and then you've got the sparkling Jewish intellectual who's a childhood refugee from Hitler's Europe. Nixon's shy and socially awkward. He's always shying away from meetings and receptions. Kissinger is an inveterate socialite, gossipy, effervescent, the prize exhibit at Washington dinner parties. And he also cultivates an image as a ladies' man, and he's very ostentatiously dating movie stars of the day, people like Liv Ullmann and Jill St. John. But as with Nixon, things weren't always what they seemed. One girlfriend remarked wryly, "I just don't think Henry was interested in sex. He didn't have time for it. Power for him may have been the aphrodisiac, but it was also the climax." And people who were close to Kissinger noted that his nails were bitten down to the quick. He and Nixon were in fact essentially similar, ambitious loners, obsessed about their image and their place in history. And they were also natural conspirators, sure that secrecy was the key to success in negotiating an end to the Vietnam War. The secrecy was vital to avoid leaks and press comment that could smother their diplomacy before it had a chance to bear fruit.
Kissinger had already created a confidential backchannel to the Kremlin, and he now started to make secret overtures to the Chinese.
Yes, after some covert advance contacts via Pakistan, in July 1971, Kissinger flew in secret from Pakistan over the Himalayas into the forbidden city of Beijing. And there he met Zhou Enlai, and he was hugely impressed. You know, there was none of the usual Russian-style point scoring. Their talks amounted in total to more than 17 hours, and Zhou came over as a realist who spoke to the point clearly without notes. And Kissinger claimed that Zhou Enlai ranked with Charles de Gaulle as the most impressive foreign statesman he'd ever met. But this statesman who dazzled Kissinger was very much under the shadow of Mao, because Zhou Enlai had tried repeatedly to damp down the regime's excesses. And Mao didn't forget slights. He was a brutal bully. And in fact, later in the 70s, he even denied Zhou Enlai the treatment he needed for bladder cancer, partly because Mao didn't want his premier to outlive him, but also, I think, just because of pure sadism.
That's really, really horrible. Going back to July 1971, how did Nixon react when he received Kissinger's message that Zhou Enlai had signalled China's agreement in principle that the president would be invited to visit Beijing?
Well, Nixon was beside himself with delight. He scribbled a message of congratulation to be sent to Kissinger, and it read, "When you return, I plan to give you a day off in compensation for your superb service to the nation." Well, you know, you might think that's like Nixon's trying to crack a joke, but I don't think he was. Nixon didn't do irony, just hard work.
The opening to the Chinese was a stunning public relations coup, which really took the world by storm.
Yes, but what really infuriated Nixon was that Kissinger gained much of the credit, and it turned him almost overnight into an international celebrity. called the modern Metternich after the great Austrian statesman of the 19th century, dubbed Super K and widely depicted as the shrewd helmsman who was piloting Nixon on a dramatic voyage into the unknown. Nixon absolutely needed Kissinger as the backroom dealmaker, his Sherpa, but he hated sharing the limelight.
So Nixon's visit to China eventually took place in February 1972, and it was carefully scheduled for primetime TV back home.
Yeah, the whole thing was a photo opportunity. And just to be sure that Kissinger didn't muscle in on any of this, when Air Force One arrived in Beijing, burly Secret Servicemen blocked the aisle as the president and his wife walked down the steps and into history. They weren't sharing that with Henry Kissinger. So the whole visit was in fact a PR triumph. The Chinese, as much as the Americans, were meticulous about the stage management, from the famous handshake with Mao to the carefully choreographed visit to the Great Wall of China. And it's interesting if you think about it. I think in terms of American politics, this breakthrough could only have been pulled off by a right-winger and someone who was a really celebrated anti-communist like Nixon, a man who could not possibly be criticised for being soft on the Reds.
It must have been quite surreal, Mao, the leader of a country long seen as America's enemy, welcoming Nixon in China, really with open arms.
Yeah, I mean, it was really. Mao was in frail health, but he insisted on meeting Nixon personally. Their discussions were brief, but they were symbolic, captured on film and photographs and so on. Nixon later called the trip the week that changed the world.
And it worked brilliantly for the Chinese too, didn't it? Because the US stopped recognizing the nationalists on Taiwan and accepted the People's Republic as the holder of China's seat on the UN Security Council. That must have felt like a huge win for Mao.
Yeah, absolutely. Just remember, 20 years before, in the early 1950s, troops from the US and the People's Republic of China had been fighting each other in Korea. So this rapprochement was a clear sign that China was stepping out of the shadows and reclaiming its place on the global stage.
And strategically, this also sent a powerful message to the Soviets. How did Brezhnev and the Kremlin react to the Sino-American thaw?
Well, with alarm, uncertainty, suspicion, just exactly what Nixon and Kissinger had hoped. The Soviet Union prided itself on being the leader of the communist world. So this rapprochement between its two main rivals was in danger of leaving them isolated. Moscow had no idea what else was going on behind the scenes, behind all the hoopla and so on and the photographs. But the possibility of a real US-China alliance, however informal, was deeply alarming.
And that's why the Soviets didn't just sit back and sulk. They responded by quickly inviting Nixon to Moscow.
Yeah, absolutely. Brezhnev knew the best way to counterbalance American and Chinese diplomacy was to engage the Americans themselves. So Kissinger's hurriedly invited to discussions in the Kremlin. Nixon's wary. He wants concessions on Vietnam before he's going to be willing to hold any meeting with Brezhnev. But Kissinger regarded a summit between the two leaders as the priority, and he forged ahead on his own once he was in Moscow. And Nixon was furious. He just fumed impotently that Henry was simply breastfeeding the Soviets. Tell him no discussions of the summit before they settle Vietnam. And that is an order.
So there are divisions opening up between the two men now.
Yeah, Kissinger just went on to set up the summit in Moscow essentially on his terms. So the Nixon-Kissinger struggle for the limelight was now almost becoming a struggle for power. And on Kissinger's return from Moscow, according to the diary of Nixon's chief of staff, Bob Haldeman, the president was, as Haldeman put it, all primed to whack Henry. But then he backed off when the two men met. And that was typical of Nixon. He's a tough talker in private, but he loathes face-to-face confrontation. And Kissinger knows that.
So in May 1972, Nixon does touch down in Moscow. And you write in your book, Summits, that he prepared for his meetings by watching the James Bond movie From Russia with Love.
Yeah, well, he was welcomed in Moscow, if not with love, at least, well, with oceans of champagne. And when they arrived, the president and his wife were driven to a suite of very grand, ornate rooms near the Kremlin. And then they'd hardly settled in when Nixon was invited to meet Brezhnev. This was the kind of surprise the Soviets liked to throw at summits, to keep opponents off balance. The meeting began with some stern opening lines denouncing American actions in Vietnam, which Nixon sensed was a necessary ritual. But then the conversation warmed up.
I can remember Brezhnev's granite-like face topped with those crazy bushy eyebrows from archive newsreels. What was he like as a leader to talk to?
Well, he was a larger-than-life figure. He was vain, he was overweight, increasingly addicted to liquor and pills. A bit theatrical. He loved to present himself with medals. He had them all over his chest. Where he and Nixon found common cause in that first meeting, I think, was in their shared belief in personal diplomacy. They talked of Roosevelt and Stalin making agreements at the top to overcome differences among their subordinates. Nixon said, "If we leave decisions to the bureaucrats, we will never achieve any progress." And Brezhnev laughed in his very hearty way, and he banged the table and he said, "They will simply bury us in paper."
And Nixon and Brezhnev did manage to make progress.
Yeah, there were, plenty more of these, for the record, diatribes from the Soviets about American imperialism in Vietnam. There were endless toasts at banquets as the Soviets tried to drink the Americans under the table. And in meetings, they deployed the old Stalin technique of shifting from nice guy to tough guy and back again without warning. But unlike in Beijing, there was substance in Moscow as well as symbolism. Nixon signed a series of agreements with the Soviets, above all on arms control, and that was a huge breakthrough. The Strategic Arms Limitation Agreement, SALT I, and the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. These were major wins for both sides, reducing the risk of nuclear war. Now, the treaties were actually the result of lengthy haggling and drafting by arms control experts on both sides. But the experts were instructed to leave some loose ends for the leaders to tie up, so that they then could claim a brilliant negotiating triumph.
All very Machiavellian.
Well, I'd say normal politics, really. Both leaders are sticking their necks out here in the face of really committed, grizzled cold warriors at home in Moscow and in Washington. Each needed to claim a famous victory.
So in the end, this triangular diplomacy orchestrated by Nixon and Kissinger proved something of a win-win-win, really. All parties got something in 1972. China gained recognition and came in from the cold. The Soviets secured arms control that would help them diversify their economy. And the Americans had created the conditions in which they could finally plot a way out of a disastrous, long foreign war.
Yeah, the US had found those big sweeteners that could persuade Beijing and Moscow to wind down their support for North Vietnam and push it towards the negotiating table. But I think it's true to say Beijing and Moscow had gained unprecedented recognition from Washington, putting them closer to equality with the United States.
It's pretty remarkable if you think this is just 10 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the world was really on the brink.
Yeah, I think Nixon's visits to Beijing and Moscow really show the positive power that Summitry can have. If you reflect on all this, in 3 dramatic months in 1972, from February to May, Nixon's overturned a quarter century of Cold War history, becoming the first US president to visit the 2 capitals of communism. And his policy of détente, which means relaxing superpower tension, offered hope for an end to the Vietnam War and the prospect of a new, more peaceful world.
How important in all that was Nixon's double act with Kissinger?
Oh, I think massively important. You know, just think back to that mess Kennedy got into at Vienna in 1961 when he was trying to do too much too quickly without enough time to prepare, or I think even to think. In 1971 and 72, Kissinger did much of the legwork and the groundwork. He was the one checking out the big players in Beijing and Moscow. He was the one preparing the outlines of key agreements. The problem was that he and Nixon had huge egos, so collaboration often turned into competition.
So in the presidential election of 1972, Nixon won a landslide victory, being re-elected with 60% of the popular vote, a quite extraordinary figure. The summits were the pinnacle of Nixon's presidency, but even as he was doing this reshaping of the world order, his paranoid backchannel style of doing politics was unraveling his presidency at the same time.
Yeah, that's right, I think. Nixon's mistrust of others, both in politics and the press, was corrosive. You know, he kept an enemies list. He wiretapped opponents. He relied on secrecy to an almost pathological degree. And the same traits that made Nixon a wily and effective deal-maker on the world stage were going to undo him. As his rivalry with Kissinger intensified, Nixon started taping meetings to protect himself against his advisor, who often leaked distorted accounts of their conversations to the press. And these are the tapes that finally brought Nixon down. They provided the evidence of his complicity in the attempted cover-up of a Republican dirty tricks operation that had gone wrong. It was a burglary at the Democratic National Committee's offices in the Watergate building in Washington in June 1972. And this came to light after Nixon's election victory.
Did he try to deflect from all this and use Summitry to revive his political fortunes?
Yes, as the Watergate crisis deepened in 1973, he invited Brezhnev to Washington. He was hoping that way to keep up the momentum of détente and distract the press from what was going on at home. But it was too late. And in fact, I think being in the United States, having direct exposure, he and his team, to the US media, showed Brezhnev that the Nixon presidency was now clearly crumbling. And eventually, with impeachment looming, in 1974, Nixon resigns in disgrace. And then, during 1975, the communists took over not only South Vietnam, but the whole of Indochina. So this evident power vacuum in Washington, in Southeast Asia, encourages the Soviets to expand elsewhere. They see détente as a way now, if you like, of making the world safe for what they would call class struggle. With less danger of a nuclear conflagration, there was more opportunity for them to support wars of national liberation in, for example, Africa. As the situation worsens for the Americans, in 1976, Nixon's successor as president, Gerald Ford, banned the word détente from the official diplomatic lexicon. Other Republican critics like Ronald Reagan castigated Kissinger for a policy of weakness and retreat. So Nixon's really precipitous crash from his peak performance, if you like, in 1972, relegated Cold War Summitry to the back burner.
David, thank you for helping us navigate détente and for probing that paradox of Richard Nixon, a man whose vision reshaped the world but whose flaws laid him low. Thank you, listeners, for joining us on Creating History. Next time we'll explore the Camp David summit of 1978, when a very different kind of American president attempted to broker peace in the Middle East with a historic deal between Israel and Egypt. You've been listening to David Reynolds and Russell Barnes in Creating History. Please rate, review and recommend our show on your favourite podcast app. It really helps us get the word out and extend our reach. You can follow us at @creating_hist on X or Instagram and send us your comments and questions there or by email to info@clearstory.co.uk. Also, do check out our first series, Creating Churchill, available wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to buy us or the team a coffee at ko-fi.com, we'd be very grateful. Details of how to donate are in the podcast description. Creating History is produced and edited by Russell Barnes, with music by Rich Farnsworth, digital marketing by Lee Mann, and sound engineering by Andrew Chappell. Creating History is a Clear Story production.